Hello, and welcome to the, September Liberal Values panel discussion entitled Beyond the Panel, Implementing Pluralistic Practice in Social Work Education. This group participated in the 2025 Heterodox Conference, a similar panel. That one was entitled Promoting Pluralism in Practice. So similar, same group here. And we wanted to give this panel an opportunity to discuss issues and ideas that there either wasn't time to discuss at Heterodox, or maybe things that have come up that they've thought about or experienced since that time. So this panel is part of a series of podcasts and panels that we have done in the last year on the state of social work education in collaboration with ProSocial Workers. And we encourage you as listeners to check out that content. Instead of reading bios or whatever, introducing as we go around, what I'm thinking is that when I ask this first question, if you would introduce yourself as part of, because I think it's relevant to this first question. So to sort of get things going, we'll introduce, if you would introduce yourselves, and then tell us a little bit about what are your hopes for a genuinely pluralistic social work environment, not just in theory, but in practice. So again, introduce yourself a little bit and how that's relevant. Why are you here? And focused on a genuinely pluralistic social work environment. Does anybody want to volunteer to start? Or should I call on you?
Yeah, I can go first. So my name is Nafis. I'm currently an associate professor of social work. And my hope in leaning into the pluralistic environment is creating space for disagreement, space for constructive disagreement, open inquiry, and viewpoint diversity. Not for the sake of changing people's minds necessarily, but for the sake of understanding that the way that we think isn't the way that everybody thinks, and being kind and acting in good faith in that regard.
Tiffany?
Sure. I am Dr. Tiffany Victoria Jones. I am also an associate professor of social work, and I think my overarching goals, the main one I would say is just that people would start to think. I think that a lot of what I know I experienced and others, and just what I'm aware of in terms of forcing ideas on people, it's without a lot of thought. It's just it's really what's popular. It's what's expected. So I would like for us to get back to being the academy where we are those great thinkers. And like Nafis said, those stops, we can disagree. There's nothing wrong with that. People have been disagreeing forever. My thing is, as long as we're able to defend our position, that's what's important to me. And I think that's the part that's lost.
My name is Matt Watson, and I am the executive director of ProSocial Workers. And I am not an academic. I'm more of a practitioner, a licensed clinical social worker. And I, as the executive director of ProSocial Workers, what I would like to see in social work practice and education is that we humanize differences, that we dialogue across differences rather than demonizing those differences or strawmanning arguments or defining people or different individuals or groups of individuals in a less than responsible or humane way. And ultimately, I would like to see us grounded in ethical principles. And I believe that the NASW Code of Ethics, the 6 primary principles, the 6 values, the core values of service, social justice, the worth of the individual, the importance of human relationships, competence, and integrity, all of those principles are very solid. And if we stick to those principles and balance the tension that sometimes emerges from those principles, that we can find our way together and have ultimately a more pluralistic world where we can live together and strengthen one another.
So, Matt, can you share a specific example of when you've had to sort of navigate these waters and try to balance the orthodoxy with those social work
Sure.
principles?
Sure. That is actually the genesis of ProSocial Workers. Dr. Alam, Nafisa, and I, we have created this organization together with Xander Kaag, and the genesis of our organization started to some degree in 2018, when there was a post on the My NASW board that's kind of a post board sponsored by the National Association of Social Workers, where social workers can post different questions and comments. And the question came up, can someone with traditional conservative values be a real social worker? And one gentleman posted a statement that, well, you have to show how your values align with the code of ethics, or how conservative values would align with the code of ethics. And so I posted a response to that after a few days of just observing on the board. And there was actually, for the most part, some pretty positive responses, but there were also some very critical responses. And subsequent to that is when the acquisitions editor for the NASW Press reached out and asked if we were interested in working on a book project. And I reached out to the individual who was quite critical of people with conservative values being, quote, real social worker. Interestingly, just over time and just by continuing to dialogue with people and to share differences, it kind of galvanized to the point where there were many people who expressed interest in this movement. And Nafis has done a great job within Heterodox Social Work, HXA, and has done a really nice job of creating an academic community. And we are doing our part to create a practice community, if you will, where continuing education is offered around pluralism and promoting viewpoint and political diversity in social work. I'll just say that I didn't respond to it yet, but just this past weekend, the same individual that kind of challenged anyone who believed that conservative values could align with the code of ethics, I noticed a post just on Saturday on that same board describing anyone who voted for Donald Trump as a radical or an extremist. And whether you believe or support Donald Trump's initiatives, President Trump's initiatives, to define half of the population who voted for him as extreme or radical, I think that creates a pretty significant distance between social work as a profession and the general population. And while I don't agree with everything that Donald Trump does, I don't think it's wise to demonize or suggest that someone is extreme simply for voting for him, or in some case voting against his opponent.
So, Tiffany, what do you believe are the most persistent institutional or cultural barriers or facilitating forces relevant to implementing pluralism in social work and social work education and social work practice?
I think the main barriers are the main barrier is that there is an idea about what social work is. I think there's a general idea about who social workers are. And I think almost maybe a prototype. And there are lots of people who don't fit into that prototype. Matt was just speaking about conservatives being social workers. And it's so funny that he mentioned that, because that's how social work started. Social work started out of moral work. That was the aim. I think of Harriet Tubman. I was taught about social workers who were such prior to there being an actual profession called social work. Harriet Tubman, Ida B. Wells, others, E. Franklin Frazier, there are plenty. The National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, who did all of these, this work that we now call social work. And it was rooted in morality. At somewhere along the line, that shifted. So this idea now that the prototype, if you will, of social work is a person who is not conservative, and in fact, such a person must be excluded. I think that's a huge barrier, because when they're excluding people, and it's happening in the classrooms, it's happening at that level where students are being told. I was told, I don't call myself any of those labels, but I am a born again believer. So I will say that I worship Jesus Christ. So I will say that that's my label, if you will. And I was told that you can't be a social worker. You might find another profession. My thing is, well, who are you? Who are you to tell me that I can't appreciate these beautiful core values? Because I do. And so I think they're excluding people who can do very good work with clients based on their presenting problems, not based on some ideology or some political label. So I think that would be the most pronounced one, is this idea of what a social worker is supposed to be. And that has nothing to do with our core values.
So, Nafis, what do you believe might be some of the most persistent, either institutional and cultural barriers or facilitators of that are relevant to implementing pluralism in social work and social work education?
I think it's the people serving as gatekeepers, similar to what Matt and Tiffany just mentioned, is that, the origins and the corest of core values that exist in social work are truly inclusive. It's not just inclusive of a single ideology, but inclusive of different viewpoints, different political perspectives as well. However, social work and the NASW Code of Ethics states precisely the following, that the NASW Code of Ethics doesn't tell you how to interpret and apply the NASW Code of Ethics. Matt's a much bigger expert on this than I am, and he agrees, so obviously it must be true. So this is part of the beauty and the curse, right? Because the beauty of the NASW Code of Ethics, our Code of Ethics, social workers' practice Code of Ethics, is that the Code of Ethics itself does not tell you how to interpret and apply the Code of Ethics. That's a beautiful part, in my opinion. The curse part is this: those who are the strongest, meaning those who have the most, essentially have won popularity contests or have just outlasted others, get to dictate how the NASW Code of Ethics are interpreted and applied, and essentially reward those who interpret and apply the Code of Ethics based on what they perceive it to be the right way, and penalize those who don't. So it's this weird thing where the barrier isn't the education itself. The barrier isn't the literature or the Code of Ethics itself or anything like that. it's the fact that there are people who, whether acting in good faith or bad faith, I still assume good faith, interpret our core values in such a way that inclusion means exclusion, diversity means uniformity, right? When it comes to ideological, viewpoint, and political inclusion and diversity. And I want to cut them some slack here because I genuinely believe, and I'm trying my best too. It's something that I think myself and we all can work on. Is trying our best to assume good faith in everyone's arguments, especially those who we disagree with. And so in assuming good faith, I do believe that people who think that there is a one way to think about social work, only one opinion you can have about Donald Trump, for example, hopefully they're not acting in bad faith, but rather they think that they are doing what a superhero might do, or what a hero in general might do, protecting civilization, sometimes from themselves, sometimes from their own ignorance. And it's a conversation. I don't know if it's in the questions here, but I'm sort of thinking about this as I'm speaking, and I'll stop speaking because I feel like I'm dominating time here. But what responsibility do we have, Elizabeth? This goes for you too. I know you're not a social worker, but what responsibility do mental health professionals, healthcare professionals have of protecting people from themselves? And if the answer is we have that responsibility, then I can certainly see those opposing this perspective and saying, no, social work should be an orthodoxy because people don't know how to protect themselves from themselves. And I believe that they are acting in good faith. I, however, tend to disagree with that. I don't think that it is my responsibility, Matt, Tiffany, and of course, Elizabeth, feel free to chime in and disagree, but I do not believe it's my responsibility to protect people from themselves. And so I naturally lean into more heterodoxy in my field and in all fields. So that's my answer to that question, which then results in branching out into many other questions, I'm sure.
Well, there is, of course, a whole field of psychology on like why people vote against their own interests or what, and the argument is really that people don't know their own, can't take care of themselves or whatever. They don't say that because that's not the motivation, as you say, like they have a pro-social motivation for, doing that kind of research. But it's interesting because that is some of the most difficult research for me as a PhD in psychology to understand. Really, there's, all these articles and I read them and I'm like, I still can't grasp this concept. And so I think that it's kind of interesting that, it's hard. I think it would be harder and harder not to reveal your own hypocrisies when you, when you go down that road, because then of course, we've all we've also had a podcast on religion, right? And we did a book club on religion, and the very, the hypocrisy that everyone needs religion except me. I'm a religious person, the least religious person or whatever. And I'm like, well, yeah, it's great for, I think you all do need, I think that's great, but I don't need it, and that it's a similar kind of analogy, right? So do current, and this would really be more for Tiffany and Nafis again, do the current social work educational sort of accreditation standards support pluralistic approaches? Do you think that it's embedded in this accreditation process that we do these kinds of things that we're talking about today?
I think, Tiffany, you want to go first?
Okay. Well, I think it's supposed to. I think it's intended to. So the most recent iteration of the CSWE EPAS standards added anti-racism to its DEI acronym. I forget the thing. I think it's number 2 or number 3, but it's it added anti-racism. It's got diversity, inclusion, equity. I think on its face, I think those virtues definitely speak to pluralism, because it includes everybody for the most part. Diversity definitely is also inclusive. Inclusion is obviously inclusive. Equity speaks to including everybody, and everybody is different. So I think embedded in anti-racism, we all have, we have an array of cultures. So it's supposed to speak to this idea of not endorsing a race over another or something to that effect. So I think on the face of it, the virtues are very beautiful. But the way I describe it, I say that somebody was playing in the mud and they got their hands dirty and they went and touched these beautiful values, the virtues of anti-racism, of diversity, of equity, of inclusion, and they got them all dirty. And so now those terms have become sources of mockery and sources of contempt. What a shame that is. And I think in part because it's been my experience, I could be very wrong, but when they say anti-racism, it's quite different than what I think of when I hear the term. I don't think it means anti-racism. I think it does mean, oh, we'll get a bunch of brown-skinned people, all these different browns, mahoganies and the caramels and the cocos and the dark chocolates. We're going to get all that, the honeys and the brown sugars. We get all these browns together, just so long as they think the same way. And not only the same way, just so long as they use, in essence, a Eurocentric lens. So all you brown people, y'all can join in. Just think how we think, and then you'll be accepted. And I think that is, unfortunately, that's how I've observed anti-racism, diversity, and inclusion in particular being employed. So I think ultimately it is supposed to include pluralism, but I haven't seen it in action. In fact, I've seen the exact opposite.
Yeah, I echo those words. Myself, I consider myself chunky peanut butter, if you would. But and then when the sun comes out, I'm a little bit darker. But there are titles, there are words, and then there are meanings. And so anti-racism, just based on what it sounds like, would be just not being racist. But I found that those who talk about anti-racism are generally surprised by a Black or brown conservative. How did this happen? And so right away, I think, could there be racism within anti-racism? And I've written extensively on this, especially as of late. But the idea around that is, just because you call something X does not make it X. And quite the opposite, in fact, that if you really wanted to act in a racist way, the best cover you could possibly have is to call yourself racist, anti-racist. If you really wanted to be sexist, the best cover you would have is to call yourself an anti-sexist. And again, don't want to get into the realm of assuming bad faith here, but that would be the absolute best cover. They talk about hiding in plain sight. This is explicitly calling ourselves, some people call themselves anti-racist, but they're surprised to find a Black or brown person that thinks differently. So when I look at universities, your original question was about the academy. And when I look at university graduations in particular, and they talk about how diverse their graduating class is or incoming class is, it's usually accompanied by a picture, as though that picture tells us all that we need to know about the diversity that exists in that room. If we were to go into that room, black, brown, white, Muslim, different sexual identities and all that. And every one of those students, 30 students, were to think the same, and that's classroom A. But then in classroom B, we have only black students, or only white students, or only gay students, 30 of which, all of whom think differently. You tell me, where is there more diversity? Now this, for our watchers and our listeners, I imagine there'll be a 50-50 split. Because in some cases, that visual representation of diversity is enough. Look how diverse we are. Don't ask them any questions, though, because they'll all have the same answer. But that's what diversity looks like. Me, tipping my hand a little bit, I'm interested in content of character diversity, not color of skin diversity. I want to talk to these people. I want to see if they think differently. Despite getting the same education, have they gotten the kind of education that allows them to think differently from their professors, to think differently from themselves? That's where real diversity is. And I've been surprised to find how much intellectual diversity there is in the Midwest versus the coastal areas, where in the coastal areas you have superficial diversity. Check, check, and check. But in the Midwest, I've been surprised to find how much intellectual diversity there has been.
So Matt, this question's, I mean, you'll answer it and have a different perspective. And so, this, I know you've kind of talked about some of this in terms of professional hours, internship sites and, training sites and stuff. So, how do we distinguish between, those necessary, those professional standards that have to be met for people in order to get their licensure and ideological orthodoxy?
Well, some of that generates from what Nafis was just talking about, and the question about the educational standards, the CSWE educational standards and does, I would agree, and I would just ask, similar to what Nafis was just asking, what brand of anti-racism are we talking about? What brand of diversity are we talking about? What brand of equity are we talking about? What brand of inclusion are we talking about? If you look at equity, it's mentioned, I think, twice in the NASW Code of Ethics, but in social justice, it describes how the definition includes the reference to equality of opportunity, not necessarily the equality of outcome or redistribution. Yes, we want to make sure that people are cared for and taken care of, but there's a diverse way of making sure that happens. It doesn't always have to happen statutorily. It's oftentimes much more efficient to engage people's goodwill, their attachment to their children, to their faith community, those kinds of things that don't require coercion, don't require force of law. There are many ways that you can go about in a practice bringing about, some of these desired outcomes that truly are pluralistic. There is a role for government, thus the NASW Code of Ethics. That's a governing document. If we were to critically review the Code of Ethics and deconstruct it, we may as well deconstruct, the profession of social work. How does this play out in practice? Well, what starts in the academy oftentimes flows into practice. The individual that I was telling you about, I invited him to participate with me in that book project. And one of the questions that he asked me was, should a social work internship, a CSWE accredited institution, allow a student to do an internship in a homeless shelter that requires couples to be married to one another in order to sleep together or be in the homeless shelter together? Or should they not allow, if it's a faith-based institution, should they be allowed to, can an internship site be allowed to discriminate and not allow a gay couple to be in the homeless shelter to sleep there together? And that's a very challenging question, because there are some competing, there's some tension there between trying to provide service and to honor the dignity and worth of a person, while also recognizing that there are communities who have beliefs about sexuality, about what chastity might look like. And should organizations, should social work focus and limit its focus on people who don't have those values, who don't espouse, conservative values about sexuality or about chastity? Or should the tent include faith communities that may have those beliefs and values? This is where there's a tension, and there needs to be a dialogue. And in my perspective, I believe that that social work needs more resources, that we need to be very careful about being exclusive about where interns can practice based on an ideological paradigm or an ideological perspective. There are many people with different ideas, different ideologies, different values, different beliefs, and social work should be able to include most of those ideologies. I'm not saying everything that that everything should be included, but I do believe that if we're going to serve more people, we need more resources and more communities participating in that service.
So I imagine, Matt, that you're thinking about, again, sort of the accreditation agencies, or, internship supervisors or whatever, saying no to certain, internships. What about the opposite? So, should some of those, maybe a faith-based organization, should they be allowed to, or let's say, should they be allowed to reject an intern because that intern isn't Catholic, or isn't, on board with theirs? So, I'm sort of trying to flip it around here. So,
sure.
Yeah.
Sure. The Supreme Court has ruled on that I can't cite it right off the top of my head, that religious organizations, by definition, are allowed to discriminate based on religion. Otherwise, you would have someone representing the faith or the faith-based organization who may not share, or who may not engage in the approved practices of the sponsoring institution. You might have, a Jewish person acting as a Catholic priest, or a bishop in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints acting as a rabbi. There are reasons why faith-based institutions are statutorily and legally allowed to discriminate, because those faith-based institutions have a primary purpose. And so the answer to your question is, not only do I believe that they can and perhaps should be able to discriminate, but the Supreme Court has ruled on that time and again that they can and they should, or just that they can, not necessarily that they should.
So the argument then is that a non-Catholic, say, social worker cannot practice social work within a Catholic organization because they don't reflect Catholic values. It
depends on the Catholic social services standards or principles. They may or may not allow that. If they do, I know that, for example, I lived in Arizona for a time, and I know that Catholic charities did have interns of different faiths. Jewish Family Services, I know, employed people of different faiths, but not all faith traditions do. And that in, that sometimes having that faith tradition is extremely important, and it's not just limited to clergy. It can be expanded to all people who are employed by those faith-based communities.
I just am sort of recognizing a little bit of a hypocrisy there, and so I'm kind of, I'm just wondering, if it's so we should, and I mean I agree with your point, but I'm just sort of poking the bear.
No, I think where it makes sense is that I don't know that it's well, it may be perceived as hypocritical, but should an organization with a specific ideology, with a specific approach to family, to some values, I think the essential question is, should they be? Can you be a social worker in an exclusive environment, in a non-inclusive environment? Well, that's a good question. Should social work include organizations or entities that are exclusive? And I would say on a broad level, yes. Otherwise, you're going to be limiting what social work can do. And some of those exclusive organizations need social workers too, need social workers who understand their specific community, their values, their beliefs, and so forth.
So Tiffany, you unmuted, so you must have something to add.
I do want to add to that. I think this is going back to an earlier point that even in such an organization, the core values are what should be taught, or the competencies, the core, those core competencies that students are expected to get at those in organizations, whatever that agency is. That's where those competencies come into play. And so I mentioned this earlier, that when we look at the core values, we look at those competencies that we're supposed to be getting as social workers, we're supposed to have as social work students, they're getting the type of organization. I don't know that it so much matters what that type of organization is, social service organization is, so long as they're teaching those core competencies. And I think in that instance, it gives students a lot of it gives students exposure to varying types of organizations, and where they're able to see that they can employ those competencies across the host of social service agencies that are out there.
So what's different about, I'm sorry to keep coming back to this, but I can't let go of this, because we've defined those sites as places that have, as organizations that have morals and values that need to be protected. Why isn't social workers, the social work organization, the same? Why aren't they able, why are we arguing that they shouldn't similarly protect their own organization and their morals and values? Are we arguing that because we don't agree with them, we think that diversity means something different, or we think that, are we caught here in our own hypocrisy?
I would say no. And the reason I say that, Elizabeth, is because across the board, where there are a host of different social service agencies, and they include those that are religious, those that might not be religious, those that have whatever aim, all social work, all of it is intended to improve the well-being of the client. And so that's where it can look, so we're going to be doing social work in these different types of agencies. That doesn't mean that you take on the morals of for example, let's see. I'm the worst with examples. I don't even know why I said that. Look, where I'm trying to go with this is that it doesn't mean that you take on the ideologies, if you will, of the. I'm not Catholic, for example. Okay, I think that's a good one. I'm not Catholic. I could very well fit in at a Catholic institution, a Catholic social work agency, as long as I'm expected to do the core values. To undergird my work with the core values, to demonstrate those core competencies. Those competencies are not tailored to any specific social work agency. They're tailored to social work agencies in general. So I do think that I think it's perfectly okay, and I think it's the right thing, in fact, for an agency. You mentioned faith-based agencies. I think faith-based agencies would be hypocritical to go against what they profess to believe for whatever reason. I have a problem with that. I lose respect for any person or any agency who goes against what they claim to believe. The core competencies, the core values are not antithetical to faith-based organizations or non-faith-based organizations. They're not tailored to that. And so students should be able to demonstrate those core values, whether they're in a Catholic charities or whether they're in a non-religious institution. I don't think that it's hypocritical.
I think it digs at an interesting topic, because does heterodoxy inevitably include orthodoxy? Because if you include every way of thinking, wouldn't that also include the way of thinking that suggests that there's only one way of thinking? So, I respectfully would disagree with Tiffany, and I think that's the beauty of these conversations, heterodox types of conversations, in that the more I think about it, I'm an absolute hypocrite. I think all of us are, especially when it comes to like things that we're really passionate about, emotional about, So I think it's, in my opinion, it would be best if we leaned into that. So when you talk about or ask about, Elizabeth, religious organizations practicing, not your words, I'll just assume that, like, selective heterodoxy, which essentially would in some ways mean selective orthodoxy. Why then would it not be appropriate for social work organizations, CSWE, ASWB, NASW, to also practice selective heterodoxy, aka selective orthodoxy? And I don't think I have an answer for that, except to suggest that what if we were to lean into the ways that we are hypocrites? When you have religious organizations that practice in some ways selective heterodoxy, and professional organizations that also practice selective heterodoxy in other ways, what if we were to create a space for all of those ideas to exist, where we're not trying to claim that I'm not a hypocrite, you're the hypocrite? What if we were all to say, I'm just as much of a hypocrite as you are, we are just as much of a hypocrite as that group is, but let's create an environment where we can just like have fun being hypocrites and be productive. Not about having fun, right? It's about doing what's best for our clients. And that's, I'm sure we're going to get to this. And I know Matt will for sure talk about this. He's coming from the practice perspective. We are here to serve our clients. And our clients are going to come from very differing backgrounds, or different races, different ideologies, definitely different socioeconomic status. So if we were to create a space where all of these different ideas, hypocritical, conflicting, selective heterodoxy, selective orthodoxy, whatever you want to call it, if we were to create that space, I believe that we can also create a space that feels welcoming to all different clients. where they can say, I'm going to go here for these services because I know that they align better with me, instead of it being like, this is social work, this is not social work. So I don't know if it's an innovative idea or what. If it is, I want credit for it. But but maybe that's what we need to create. Instead of thinking like this is the way to be, heterodoxy is the way to be. Meanwhile, we're all in one way or another practicing orthodoxy in our own way, thinking that that itself is heterodoxy, aren't we? So I think it's a great question that has a built-in answer to it, which I can tell every time you smile in a certain kind of way, Elizabeth, of what you're thinking. We've been working together a very, very long time now, right? So I think it's a great question, but that's my perspective. I'm curious to hear Matt's too.
Well, I think if we appeal to the code of ethics and we look at those 6 values, number 1, the dignity and worth of the person. Humans are inherently of worth and there's dignity in the human being. In my belief is I see all of us as part of a broad human family. We are all brothers and sisters. So that's one element of the code of ethics. The next is, well, what does it mean to be a social worker? Is there a code of ethics at all? Is there anything that differentiates social work from non-social work? Well, without the code of ethics, without some type of definition, without some type of a document, what gives someone the authority to say that they are social workers or not? So the very existence of the code of ethics defines what is or what is not social work. So first principle is humans are of worth. Second is there is a differentiation between what is and what is not social work. The third is where pluralism comes into play. And I think that's what Nafis and Tiffany were just describing, is that we are indeed all orthodox in our own little way, but pluralism is making space for different orthodoxies, for different perspectives, viewpoints, faiths, beliefs. And in essence, we claim the privilege of practicing social work according to the dictates of our own conscience and allow other social workers the same privilege. Let them practice how, where, or what they may. And that's a derivative of an article of faith that in my tradition, but I think that practice is what pluralism is integrating orthodoxy, the different orthodoxies that are all out there, and that's, I think, inherent in pluralism.
So we've kind of answered. We've answered a couple of the questions, sort of, sideways of the actual questions, and we're getting to the last, say, 10 minutes or so. I'm kind of watching to make sure that there's not any questions, and please type those in if you're if you have them. What gives you hope? We're maybe not. We maybe haven't focused on some. We're getting maybe into some of the positives here, but what gives you hope that social work can not only sustain itself but flourish in a pluralistic way?
I would say, go on, Matt. Okay, I would just say that the thing that really encourages me is that more people are speaking against this monolithic view of social work and what constitutes a social worker. There are more voices being heard. I think sometimes when there's a very loud voice or a very loud group of voices who've got the magnifying glass and the spotlight on them and the bullhorn, they're making all this noise. It silences or quiets other voices. And so I'm encouraged in that more people are speaking up and saying, you know, I don't agree with that, or I believe this, or I do social work in this way, still honoring the code of ethics, still undergirding with the core values, but that we don't all have to have the exact same mind. We're not all of one mind. So I like the fact that a lot of people are speaking up more.
For me, what gives me hope is that 8 years ago, our organization didn't exist. Today, we are accredited by the Association of Social Work Boards. We are accredited. It gives me hope because in 2022, Xander Kaag and I, the 2020 NASW Social Worker of the Year, Brandy Shafetinsky, we did a number of things to prepare a presentation that ultimately was presented at the 2022 NASW National Conference. 2 years ago, I didn't know Elizabeth. 2 years ago, I didn't know Nafis. 2 years ago, I didn't know Tiffany. And just by speaking up and having these conversations, and we find ourselves connecting with more and more people who do take a more heterodox view and who are practicing and seeking pluralism, who are seeking peace within pluralism. And we're also able to have these kinds of conversations where we appreciate, Elizabeth, your refining questions because they are asked in good faith, and they help us refine our thoughts and help us articulate perhaps with more clarity. Perhaps they don't, it's unsatisfactory, to you or others, but nonetheless, it helps us refine our thoughts and what we're about, and to distill it down to as much as we can the core essence of what we're trying to do. And social work is inherently pluralistic, and making space and inviting different orthodoxies into the social work tent, I think, is ultimately what we've seen, and that's what gives me hope.
Yeah, what gives me hope is just having these conversations, and all the folks that you never would have thought would be a part of this starting to get involved. We've talked a lot in the last few decades about diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism, now diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it seems like the stars are aligned and the timing is just perfect. It seems like society is ready. Most of us have always been ready. Some of the folks that I work with in heterodox social work have been ready for 3 or 4 decades now. So, there have been people that have been ready, individuals who have been ready, now organizations who are ready, and now it also seems society is ready to explore explore viewpoint and political diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I can't say how thankful I am to be just a small fraction of this, because it seems like it's going to continue to grow. For another reason, which I'm very hopeful for, is that there's nowhere else to go but in this direction. Are we going to go into more orthodoxy? We've experienced that in so many movements, especially as of late. And so even the folks who, some people like to call woke, they're starting to wake up. The woke are starting to awaken and understand that while they may not agree with certain viewpoints, it doesn't mean that they have to shut themselves out from listening to them or exploring them. And I think we're hopefully going to see a more enlightened society, one that doesn't have to agree with everything that they understand. That's what gives me hope.
What is something that people who are watching this or listening to this, what's some concrete action that that you've either taken yourselves, that you've seen work, that you hope other people will take after this panel? What would your advice be to other professors, other clinicians, other social workers, or just people who are interested in this kind of work?
I think humility goes a long way. The question that you asked about, selective heterodoxy, like if we lean into that and come to the table understanding that we are imperfect beings arguing on behalf of an imperfect idea, I think it creates an environment where we can have an imperfect conversation hoping to get better. We'll never reach perfection, but we can always get better. And I think it goes a long way. At least that's what I've learned, especially as of late, is not to come into these conversations that I've been having with all of the answers, rather coming to them with incomplete answers, sometimes just questions that haven't even been answered, so we can work through them together. Because when more people are invested in the outcome, then they're more invested in what happens after. So that's what I've learned.
I just borrowed from you, Nafis, in my class today. Well, the way I organized my whole class is around questions. We're not going to focus on the answers in this class. We're going to focus on the questions. And so I was inspired by you in my panic over having to teach a class I hadn't taught in 6 years or so, and how am I going to organize this? And organizing around questions. And I think you're right. Like, these kinds of discussions is what has, has sort of helped me to focus more on the questions than on the answers. So what about either Tiffany or Matt? What kinds of concrete sort of action things could you maybe offer the listeners, whether they're social workers or not?
I would say is to explore the other side. I like that because it gives you better insight into if you're holding a belief that could be aired. I'm very, very strong in my belief that if you can't defend what you are supporting or whatnot, then it's probably not good to support that thing. At least put a pause on it and see what else is out there in terms of other thoughts. But that's one of the things I encourage my students when they're doing their literature reviews. Don't start with your ideas because you already know what you think. Look for the literature that opposes what you believe. I think that's one way. And it gives you insight into how someone else thinks. Maybe there's a billboard that I saw. It says, "Listen, the other person might be right." Now, it's not always about being right or wrong, but I think the point was hear another voice. So that's one concrete thing that I think would be helpful.
I would say a couple of things come to mind, and I really like what Tiffany said, is listen to others, participate with others, but before you become an activist, just become a human and humanize other people. Put humans before activism. Think things through. Make sure that you do hear a different perspective before crusading. Someone might say that we are on a crusade. Well, that may be because we have looked at a number of different things and refined our thoughts and our experiences. I would say participate and listen and subscribe to the Dissidents podcast, to the Institute for Liberal Values. Follow this. You will find that you will hear conversations that matter and participate in conversations that matter. Speak up, but speak up with a willingness, a humility, as Nafis said, to learn and to be corrected and to refine your perspective rather than taking an activist approach where you insist on being right. There are many other organizations out there. You can participate in Heterodox Social Work. Braver Angels is one that comes to mind. They're fair, pro-human. There's a number of organizations that I think share similar values. Find your organization, but be careful about being an activist, and be humble in your approach to engaging with others and have conversations that matter.
Well, we appreciate your participation very much, and we look forward to more conversations, not just like this one, because we would include other voices and other opinions, right? So not just like this one. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all. Good night.